Good evening and welcome. I am Maureen Fulham, Ignatian Volunteer Corps Director for New York Metro in New York City, and I am delighted to welcome so many participants. We have people from at least 26 states, equally divided between red and blue. We have IVC Service Corps members and IVC friends, many members and friends of the Dorothy Day Guild. Together, we will be celebrating and discussing the person, politics, and passion of Dorothy Day. This is a privilege. We also have a distinguished panel. First, before I introduce them, let's just gather ourselves as community and pray. Let's place ourselves in the presence of God, loving Lord of all creation. May the beauty of all you have made draw us beyond ourselves toward you, as it did for servant of God, Dorothy Day. As we praise you, our God, for the work of your grace in her heart, it is clear that Dorothy's life was lived as one of us and as one with you. May the example of Dorothy's concern and action for the poorest and her desire for peace move our hearts to reach out to those in need around us and to be instruments of your peace in our world. We ask this in the name of Jesus, your Son, our brother and Lord. Amen. Now I'm grateful to introduce our panel. First, Colleen Dulle. Colleen, we're very happy to say, is our moderator tonight. Colleen serves on the advisory committee of the Dorothy Day Guild and is the host and producer of the podcast Inside the Vatican, also the assistant producer of audio and video at American Media. Colleen is the recipient, among other awards, of the 2019 Catholic Press Association Multimedia Journalist of the Year Award. Welcome, Colleen. Colleen, we're happy you're with us.
Thanks.
Robert Ellsberg, welcome. Robert also serves on the advisory committee of the Guild and is editor-in-chief and publisher of Orbis Books. Robert joined the Catholic Worker in the 1970s, living and working with Dorothy Day for the last 5 years of her life. He has edited many of Dorothy Day's writings. Welcome, Robert. Joseph Sclafani, a physician and obstetrician who spent many years, 4 years, volunteering in Africa, training obstetricians on an international team. Joe is an IVC Service Corps member, and we're happy to say placed with the Guild for the past 3 years. He is now on their advisory board and coordinates the transcription process for the cause. Melissa Cedillo, welcome Melissa, will graduate from Harvard Divinity School this month. Her studies focus on the intersection and interconnection of religion, ethics, and politics, and bridging the gap between progressive politics and religion in the US. Welcome. Fred Boehrer, along with his wife Diana, are co-founders of the Albany, New York Catholic Worker Community at Emmaus House. They live and support homeless families there. And Fred is an IVC member and has been one for many years. So we want to welcome you. So as we get ready to start, just one organizational note. We hope you ask questions, many questions, and comment questions, etc. Please use the Q&A function. there will be time for discussion, and then we will have a beautiful award ceremony celebrating and honoring the Guild and the Ignatian Volunteer Corps members that are here with us tonight. I now turn the evening over to Colleen, who will lead our discussion.
All right. So we have called this event a discussion on the person, politics, and passion of Dorothy Day. So I want to start with Dorothy Day's person, and who better to ask than Robert Ellsberg, who knew her personally. So Robert, first question for you. You spent the last 5 years of Dorothy's life with her, and many more with her in spirit, editing her writings. And I'd like to know what parts of her character you think are not so well known that you would like people to know more about.
Well, from my encounters with her, I think the thing that people are surprised to hear about is how much fun she was to be with. She had a great sense of humor. She had a beautiful, like a silver bell, little sort of girlish laugh that people don't associate with her, because always she didn't like to be photographed, and every time she was pictures taken of her, she's always looking very serious and kind of intimidating and frightening. But she was extremely approachable person. She was very extroverted. She enjoyed being around people, and she enjoyed young people in particular, and learning their stories and where they came from, and what books they were interested in, what their ideals or dreams were for life. I guess, a lot of my knowledge of Dorothy has come in the, 45 years since then of reading and studying her writings, editing her diaries. And there, I guess, one of the things that I got to know better about her that I don't think people realize so much is just how much of her life, her spirituality, if you want to call it, her path to holiness, was lived out in just everyday life. And with extraordinary people like that, we think that the most important parts of their life are the extraordinary things that they did, the things that were so different than the rest of us. And I learned a lot about what made Dorothy extraordinary was about the way she lived out the very ordinary daily encounters and chores and labors of life with all of its joys and sorrows.
And do you think that those, I don't know, less discovered or maybe less well-known parts of her character have anything to teach us, any lessons for us today?
Well, yes, absolutely, because a lot of the time we measure ourselves against Dorothy Day starting the Catholic Worker, or living among the poor, going to jail, walking on picket lines, and we think, well, I couldn't do all those things. And to realize that was that's a whole lifetime you're looking at, in which Dorothy she grew into being Dorothy Day. It was experimental. It was just opening the door to one person at first. It was starting a newspaper. It was going to a lot of boring meetings, talking to people, trying to beg for money. But I think that the path to our own holiness begins wherever we are. And not starting a religious congregation or being a martyr in some kind of dramatic way, but just the little kind of sacrifices of everyday life, of being more patient, of being more forgiving, of stopping to kind of arrest our impulse to judgment or anger, or at least, before we go to bed at night, thinking about it and maybe asking for forgiveness. Those are the that was the arena in which Dorothy's holiness, I think, was worked out, and it was what prepared her then for the more kind of heroic arenas that she entered later on.
Yeah, it sounds a lot like the little way of Saint Teresa, who
was her favorite saint was Teresa of Lisieux, and I never really appreciated or understand what did she see about Therese? Who could be more different than Dorothy Day than Therese? But Therese is who showed the path to holiness that lives in everyday life. And Dorothy, of course, applied that on the social level as well, to say that the difference, the power that lies in very little things. It might be just standing on a street corner with a sign for peace. It might mean handing out a flyer. It might mean staying a little extra time to pray. that all of those things we were like little, pebbles in a pond. We couldn't anticipate what kind of power or outreach they might have across the world.
That's right. So I want to turn next to Dr. Joe Sclafani, who has also spent the last 3 years kind of having an encounter with Dorothy through her writings. Joe, you've been coordinating the transcription effort, which maybe you can tell us how many transcribers it took to go through everything that Dorothy had written in preparation for her canonization cause, because if people don't know, we have to send all of that to the Vatican. We have to prep it all. And so the Dorothy Day Guild got together a big network of transcribers, and Dr. Joe's been helping coordinate that effort. And a lot of these transcribers we've heard from say, it's really been impactful for them to encounter Dorothy in her writing in a new way, even through something as simple as her grocery lists or whatever. It teaches you something about the everyday holiness of a saint. So I wonder, Joe, what impact has this work that you've been doing for the last 3 years, encountering Dorothy, had on you?
Oh, tremendous. It's been a tremendous experience, first of all, and thank you, Colleen. For 3 years, the first thing that I learned many lessons, and the first lesson I learned was humility, because I was somewhat skeptical that this was really a IVC opportunity. Typically the IVC members are working directly with the poor or with some cause, and this sounded like more of a bureaucratic paper shuffling adventure. And I quickly recognized that it was anything but, and it absolutely fits the mission for the Ignatian Volunteer Corps. And I really thank Maureen for that, for encouraging me to do that. The other thing that I learned, and you just touched upon it, is devotion. I was just really awestruck by the amount of devotion that I encountered through the transcriptionists that worked with us. We had 10,133 pages of diaries that had to be transcribed. That's a lot of work. And when I got there, Jeff had organized over 100 of them, all typing away on their Word documents. And then what we did in the Catholic Worker, at Catholic Charities and with the Guild, is we had to organize it all and prepare it for the Vatican. So I was very awestruck by that. And you have to ask, why would people do this? And particularly, why would they do this 40 years after the person has died? And in most cases, people have faded from our memories. But I think it was just the impact of Dorothy on so many people's lives that really made a difference. And I think people like myself began to view her as a role model, as how you can act out your faith. And by transcribing, by doing their part, they were acting out their faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that Dorothy also, I'll touch on this later when I'm reflecting on her politics, but I think that she presents a way of living out that faith that looks different for some people, right? It's something that they might not have encountered before. So that can be really transformative too. So before we move on to that, politics and Passion of Dorothy Day, this latter part of our title, I want to pass it off to George Horton, and maybe Maureen could introduce him. George is one of the head folks in our canonization cause, but Maureen has a better way of introducing him.
Great. George, one of our most important people, is one of our vice postulators for the cause of Dorothy Day. He is also the director of the Department of Social and Community Development at New York Catholic Charities. So we are very honored and grateful you're here with us, George.
So George, could you give us an update on how the canonization cause, after all that transcribing, is progressing?
Thank you. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Colleen. And just let me begin by saying a word of thanks for the IVC, the people being honored here tonight. If we did not have the help of the IVC, we would be weeks, months, maybe years behind in completing this enormous task. And we're particularly grateful to be honoring Joe Sclafani tonight. Joe's become a member of our Catholic Charities family. there's good news about the cause. And I think it's always important to say at the outset that many, many people believe that Dorothy Day is a saint. And the canonization process follows as the official church inquiry and affirmation of that deeply held belief. The good news, Colleen, is that there are two phases to the canonization process. The local diocesan phase, where the case for her canonization is prepared and evidence of her sanctity gathered, and the Roman phase, where the case is reviewed by the Congregation for Saints in Rome, and then a recommendation made to the Pope. The good news is we expect that this local diocesan inquiry will be completed by the anniversary of her death, November 29 of this year. Let me make just a couple comments if I can. First, the immensity of the task. Joe Sclafani and Colleen have talked about the amount of work that had to be done. Marquette University had 32 square feet of boxes filled with diaries and letters, handwritten in a script that at the least could be called difficult. All that had to be digitized and then transcribed by this army of volunteers that Joe talked about. And that group of people, as Joe said, found something very special in this work. You know, we sometimes wish Dorothy had not written quite so much, or that there had not been so much written about her. You may know that the Staten Island Ferry, they're naming a Staten Island ferry for Dorothy, and we have quipped that we probably need that ferry to transport all these documents to Rome. But the good side of that is we'd like to be on the ship as well as it goes there. But this work is completed. Our work of our historical commission, our theological censors. And I want to give a special thanks to Jeff Corrigan, who's been a friend, whose dedication in managing all these volunteers, working with the IVC, and managing these very complex parts of the inquiry. We cannot thank Jeff enough. Just the other point I'd like to make is that in the beginning, when Cardinal O'Connor brought people together in the late 90s to talk about whether Dorothy Day should be canonized, it was an incredible experience with people who knew her and knew her intimately. Robert was there, some of the great people, Adi Bethune, Eileen Egan, Frank Donovan. But there was a concern expressed that this costs a lot of money, and we should use that money to help people who are poor. As you might guess, Dorothy's constituency was not always the most wealthy group, but we have managed to keep costs low. And again, the work of the IVC has been very important to that, engaging these over 100 volunteers. I will ask that if you'd like to become a member of the Guild, and the purpose of the Guild is to spread the word of her life and legacy. And if you'd like to become a member, I ask that you go to dorothydayguild.org, and we'd love to have you be a member. There's also an opportunity there to share any graces and favors that you may have received in asking for Dorothy Day's help. Again, I've alluded to it right on this call, Dr. Joe, Colleen, Robert Ellsberg, Jeff Corrigan, now Maureen. One of the great experiences here has been the number and wonderful people who have been involved in this canonization process, including many Catholic workers. Louise Zwick of
Hey, George, I think that we've lost your audio.
Can you hear me now?
Now I hear you.
Okay.
You were thinking
Just briefly, this past weekend, we had a wonderful webinar arranged by Kevin A. Hearn of Manhattan College Dorothy Day in the global church. We spoke to Catholic workers from Australia, from the Netherlands, from the Philippines, and from France, who described their work with people who are homeless, with immigrants, people who have been abandoned and forgotten. They called them brothers and friends and sisters and family together, accompanying them in their struggle for peace and justice. By the way, I urge you, when you get to Paris, to stop in at the Dorothy Day Cafe, which is one of the works of the Catholic Worker in Paris. Just finally, there's bumps in the road, as you can imagine, trying to bring together the institutional church, the Archdiocese of New York, and Catholic workers. But I think that is the spirit of Dorothy Day, that the whole church can come together to work on this canonization process. She stands as a saint for our time, and the model she provides of peace, justice, charity, hospitality, the centrality of the Sermon on the Mount, finding Christ in every person, and love of the church can help heal great divisions in our church, society, and the world. Finally, when Francis was here, he spoke of four great Americans: Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day, and he inquired of the status of her cause. And we understand there is great interest in the progress of the cause and the canonization of this lay woman in Rome. And once we get all the documents there by the end of this year, we expect that that process will move pretty quickly. Francis often speaks of the sin of indifference and our call to accompany people who are suffering injustice. Dorothy Day was ahead of her time in living out this message. We need the models she provides. Again, we are enormously grateful for the partnership with the IVC in moving Dorothy's cause forward. And together, tonight and every night, we should say together, Deo gratias, the words on her grave in Staten Island.
Thank you so much for that reflection, George. Maureen had asked me to reflect a little bit on Dorothy Day's lessons for today's world. And what I was thinking of was how politicized and how polarized our politics are, and how Dorothy, as George was just alluding to, is someone who is able to bridge those divides and bring very, very disparate people together. And so I've got a bit of a reflection to offer here, which just starts with Dorothy Day is often described with a lot of false dichotomies. And I myself, as somebody who makes, podcasts and videos and writes at America, I've certainly been guilty of introducing her with some of those false dichotomies myself, introducing her as someone who was arrested for the cause of women's suffrage, but never actually voted herself, as an anarchist who willingly joined and professed obedience to a hierarchical church and took that commitment seriously, and framing these things as inherently opposed and as impossible to synthesize. But the thing about those dichotomies about Dorothy is that they aren't actually oppositions at all. They're synthesized in the person of Dorothy, and they force us to imagine her complexly. When you look beyond that false opposition of her as an anarchist and a Catholic, for example, and you try to understand how they're combined in Dorothy, you start to realize some linkages, that her anarchy looks a lot like the principle of subsidiarity from Catholic social teaching, having issues being handled on the level that's appropriate to them. You also start to understand why she didn't vote then, right? The people competing for political office aren't the appropriate people to be helping the people outside the door. She feels that she has to do it herself. And that's how she lived out her anarchy and her Catholicism at the same time. And so then I look at Dorothy's political stances, which kind of fall all over the political spectrum, right? She's anti-abortion, she's anti-capital punishment, she's anti-war, she criticizes what she calls the decadent, putrid industrial capitalist system. And in terms of church politics too, she starts an entire newspaper with the goal of educating people on the church's social teaching. And at the same time, she doesn't much like the liturgical reforms of Vatican II. So what do we get when we look at all of these as a whole? We get one complex and passionate and intelligent and holy person. We get a person. And I think that that is the lesson of Dorothy's politics for us, because there is some part of Dorothy's politics that challenge every single person. It forces us to imagine Dorothy complexly, like I said, and hopefully then to imagine ourselves and to imagine others complexly as more than somebody who is a political identity or as somebody who, only fits into one box, right? They force us to imagine others as complex people who demand to be loved and appreciated in their uniqueness. And it's that personalism, to use Dorothy's term, that brings with it all of its implications for how best to serve one another. And that personalism, I think, is what lies at the heart of Dorothy's politics. And if I can just link it to the Vatican, which is my pet subject to cover, it's that personalism that is the antidote then to what Pope Francis calls the labyrinth of ideology. When we let our political positions become an identity, we can sometimes descend so deep into our different ideological bubbles and our intellectual and theoretical arguments that we lose sight of the person who's standing in front of us. Dorothy invites us back to that interpersonal encounter that Pope Francis describes as having the ability to transform us and move us towards what he calls political love, caring for our neighbor through our politics in a way that's focused more on our neighbor than on ourselves. So one outcome of political love is hopefully justice, which is an essential precursor to peace, right? We love one another, we build a more just society, and you have to have that justice as a foundation for peace. So I want to turn it over now to my co-panelist, Melissa Cedillo, who's going to talk to us about one place that urgently needs peace and justice today, that is Palestine. Melissa has been involved in organizing Harvard students around support for Palestinians, and she's also visited a refugee camp there. And while she was there, she had some reflections on Dorothy's insights that really spoke to her. So I'm going to invite her to share that story.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Oh, shout out from your dog.
Sorry.
Okay, I love that. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think as someone who's read a lot of Dorothy Day and who has, learned more about who she was as a person, but also, never met her, and the world that she came up to be in and had faith in is a lot different in some ways of the world that I am in as a person. And so I think a lot of times we are compelled to say, this is what Dorothy Day would say or do. But I just know that I don't actually know what that sentence would look like because she is, as Colleen said, so complex. But I do know when I think about her writings around an anti-war framework and an anti-nuclear framework, I am left with what does this look like and what does her thought process around a lot of these mean for American Catholics who are learning about what's happening in Palestine. And it is a complex subject, but I think what I appreciate about Dorothy Day is that war in general is usually complex, and also we can't as Catholics be neutral and we can't be silent, and also we can't just take a politics that allows us to not hear or learn. And so I think when I was in the West Bank, I was struck by the fact that there is a Palestinian refugee camp. It's called the Aida Refugee Camp, a mile from where Jesus was said to be born. And I know that there are a lot of holy land trips that are Christian based that go there that never talk about that. And also I think American Catholics on another lens are struggling with what does it look like to enter this conversation, to recognize, some of this violence that is going on in occupied land without perpetuating, cycles of violence or anti-Semitism. And so all of that leads, I think, again, as Colleen said, a really complex personalism and a complex politics. But I think the beauty about faith, and I think what Dorothy Day was getting to, is that our faith allows us to sit in those complexities without being silent, without being scared, while also knowing we'll make mistakes. And so I think I sit in that as, it is a problem that sometimes seems far away, and also there is violence occurring. And I know that when we see statements coming from the Pope that calls for a ceasefire, it sounds like this is a moment of peace. And also, I think as Dorothy really touched on a lot, if we don't address those root causes that led to violence in the first place, that can often just be a Band-Aid. So we have to look at, structures of power and who holds a lot of militarization power, and what I think Dorothy Day kind of warned us a little bit about with a highly militarized international relations that we've kind of entered at this moment. So again, I don't have answers to what's going on into the Middle East, and especially not in West Bank. And I think as someone who is in the United States and an American Catholic, I do know that my job is to both take action, but to learn as well. And I think I keep Dorothy Day in mind a lot because, as Colleen explained her personality on paper, you can't pin her to one political party or one subsect of Catholicism, or even that she would belong to like one friend group, right? And I think that that invites us to say, regardless of how we vote or where we pray or the people we serve, that those things don't always have to dictate how we view foreign policy or things that are happening abroad. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak. And it has been lovely to sit with all of you to talk about someone who I think would be maybe a little flustered with this much attention. And also, I think it is amazing that we are continuing her legacy in this light.
Thank you so much, Melissa. The last person I want to toss a question to is Fred Boehrer, who is living out Dorothy's legacy today in the Catholic Worker Community in Albany, where he and his wife are living and working with homeless families and with immigrants. So Fred, could you speak a bit about your work and the places where in that work you've drawn some inspiration from Dorothy?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Colleen. And I think something that both you, Colleen, and Melissa shared is about Dorothy's political activism and also her personalism, and really seeing the dignity of the human person and the sacredness of the individual person, and to really reflect on, like, what does it mean to recognize the divine in the other person and how to treat them. And I think one of the wonderful gifts that we have from Dorothy is that there was a natural connection between offering works of mercy with offering works of justice. And so works of mercy as direct service and compassion, but linking that with advocating for a change in those systems, political systems, the military, economic systems, et cetera, that create these inequalities. And, I was thinking, my wife and I, we opened the house about 25 years ago. And when we opened, we just said we would host families. And it ended up most families coming to us are immigrants, and most of those families have been undocumented. And we really had very little experience with undocumented immigrants. And through our hospitality and living together with some of these families, sometimes for a month or 2 months, some families we've lived with for as long as a year or more, it's helped us to get to know them, for them to know us, warts and all, because I know I'm not an easy guy to live with. You can ask my kids and my wife. But also it's an opportunity when living together with other people to really go into spaces that I've never been to before, growing up as a Catholic who's middle class, like my wife. And now we find ourselves in strange places. We're visiting jails, we're visiting courthouses, we're going to immigration detention centers in Buffalo and in Newark, New Jersey at the asylum court and at the immigration center in New York City. All sorts of spaces that we had never been to before. And, one of the things I think about, there's a story Tom Cornell loves to tell about Dorothy, where this pretty affluent donor showed up at the Catholic Worker and gave Dorothy a diamond ring. And
Oh my goodness.
at the time, she kind of slipped it in her pocket. And later on in the day, one of the guests who frequents the house, and I guess she was kind of loud and maybe rubbed people the wrong way and didn't say thank you a lot. People did not care for her. And Dorothy saw this woman, and Dorothy took out the ring and gave it to her. And a lot of the other Catholic workers were really annoyed with Dorothy. And apparently they confronted her about this and said, why did you give her, of all people, that diamond ring when you could have sold the ring? And, you could have paid for rent and all sorts of things. And Dorothy said, well, it's really up to her to decide, to this woman that she gave the ring to. It's up to her. Like, she could do with it as she pleases. She could sell it and use the money to pay her rent. She can sell it and take a cruise to the Caribbean, or she can choose to wear it. And Dorothy Day asked a question, you know, like, did God make diamonds only for the rich? And, you know, and Dorothy loved that quote about, you know, the world will be saved by beauty. And I think that really has inspired Diana and me in terms of our ministry and our, our relationships with people, especially those who are vulnerable, you know, is sort of recognizing what's at the core. We had an immigrant family with us from Eastern Europe, Russian speaking for the most part. And they had just moved in with us, and it was like a mom and dad and a daughter. And the mom had asked for a handbag, like a purse, and she specifically said a leather purse. So we put the word out, and this is before email and internet. So we're putting the word out, and somebody dropped off a leather handbag, a purse, but it like there was the handle was ripped off. There were holes, all this stuff. And the mom saw it. She goes, "Oh, is that a handbag for me?" I said, "Well, no." I said, "It's not very nice. You don't want this." Because I was thinking of that story that Tom Cornell told about Dorothy. I was like, you know, our guest at our Albany Catholic Worker deserves the best. So, but the woman said, no, I'll take it. It's good enough for me. I said, "No, I don't think it's good enough for you. You deserve more." She goes, "No, really, I'll take it." And I reluctantly gave it to her. And then a month later, she and her husband and daughter asked us, like we would have dinner together. They said, "We'd like to treat you to a special dessert." And so we had this dessert. They made this Russian dessert for us. We're sitting around the table. They said, "We have a gift for you." And this is the gift that they gave us. It's this beautiful icon of St. Nicholas. Wow. And the reason why I'm sharing that with you is because this woman, she's an artist, and her husband is a carpenter. And the woman actually painted this icon. And because the family had been homeless, they didn't have painting materials. So she cut out a piece of leather from the handbag, from the purse, to use as the canvas for this icon. And then the husband used a piece of like spare wood and sort of did some woodwork to create the frame for this icon. And, you know, I think about, again, that story of the diamond ring, and again, Dorothy's quote about the world will be saved by beauty. And so I think there's so much beauty around us. You know, I saw something that should be thrown in the trash, that beat up leather handbag, but this woman saw the icon in it, you know, and there's so much I learned from people we live with, so.
Yeah, I remember when I was reading, to go back to Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti, and when I was reading it, I had a little reading group that I was working with, and there was another young man there, Mathieu Langlois. I don't know if you know him, but he does research on Peter Morin. And so he and I were in this group, and we kept reading Pope Francis's descriptions of how communities should function. And it was all these images of really very, very different people kind of coming together and, you know, even sometimes clashing, sometimes kind of having it out at the kitchen table. But at the end of the day, the thing that unites them, the kind of the thing that Francis says should unite all of us as humans, is this sense of a higher bondedness, right? A higher unitedness as children of God. And Mathieu and I in our discussion group just kept saying, this sounds exactly like the Catholic Worker. You know, this is a group of people who, oh my goodness, get so tired of each other. But at the end of the day, it's about the higher thing that they're working towards, right? It's about doing this service. And that, I think that people underestimate that can really drive you to so many places, like you were saying, places that you never thought you would go before.
Absolutely. And there are people who join the Catholic Worker who really come at it from different perspectives, you know, yeah. Like you're saying, Colleen, like it's amazing the bond that occurs, because there are some folks who come because they're interested in the political work, but not necessarily the religious faith. Mm-hmm. And then there are some folks who come to the Catholic Worker because they're interested as a Catholic, they're attracted to that, but not necessarily to the activism. And you get these kind of wonderful mixes of people coming at it from different perspectives, and really finding this wonderful blend, you know, this kind of presence of like the mystical body of Christ with all of us coming with different angles, with different gifts. It's really quite wonderful.
Exactly. I always think there's nothing more beautiful than sitting around the table in the basement of Mary House and, praying Vespers together, which Dorothy always loved to do. On that note, I want to actually share a reflection that Dorothy's granddaughter, Martha Hennessy, sent us on behalf of this event. She knew that we were all getting together to remember Dorothy's legacy. And so I asked her if she would want to say anything about her grandmother's spirituality. And I should tell all of you, the reason she couldn't be here tonight is that Martha is in prison for a plowshares action. She and a group of plowshares activists called the Kings Bay Plowshares broke into a nuclear base in Georgia, and it was a demonstration against America's nuclear arsenal. And so she is in prison right now and will hopefully soon get out. She was supposed to get out on Monday, so please keep her in your prayers. But here's a passage from what she said about her grandmother's spirituality. She says, "The strength of her prayer life bears evidence in the fact that for decades, she continued in her ministry despite opposition from her own community at times and the US institutional church. Yet she recognized that love was the only solution, and ever more love that was found in communal life." A quote from Marilyn Robinson, who wrote the novel Gilead, made me think of Dorothy's spirituality. She says, "The sacred mystery of sorrow and dignity. It is godliness to love the being of another. Your existence is a delight to the one who sees God in others. Imagine the beauty and face of such a faith, a capacity of the heart. This is what Dorothy has given to the world." So now we have a little bit of time for discussion, and I want to invite anybody who is watching who has any questions to toss your questions in the Q&A section, and in a few minutes we'll open it up. We'll start answering some of those questions from folks who have them. In the meantime, speaking of beauty and Dorothy's love of beauty, I wanted to invite Melissa. I think that you had a story about being struck by Dorothy's conception of beauty in that Palestinian refugee camp outside Bethlehem, and I was hoping you might share that with us.
Yeah, of course. I think when I was visiting one of the refugee camps, I was struck by the amount of community gardens that were still around. And like, it's very much like community gardens surrounded by the shells left from like tear gas cans. And they had turned the tear gas cans as a pots to build flowers. And I think what Dorothy Day was really good at doing is saying, yes, beauty still exists in, violence, or not in violence, but despite violence, and in resilience, and, in the poorest of places or the places with nothing. And also, I think she did a really good job of not romanticizing it. I think sometimes to avoid some of how poverty comes to be, or things like refugee camps, there can be a need to romanticize it to justify what's happening, or being like, oh, well, that's really hard, but at least there's beauty and all of that. And I think that going to the West Bank as, someone who identifies as Catholic, there was a lot of like, yes, there's still resilience. Yes, there's still beauty. Palestinians have learned how to cultivate seeds and have a seed bank to learn how to survive, because a lot of the communities in the West Bank are cut off from a lot of resources or don't have access to water. And also, Palestinians shouldn't have to do that, right? And so I think there is this kind of, everyone deserves beauty. Diamonds were not just created for the rich. And also, how do we talk about why is there not access to these things for everyone, and the inequity that allows that for it to happen? So I think, as if you identify as an activist, as someone who works in accompaniment, someone who's working vocation work, sometimes those are all the similar things. I think there is this need to want to solve and to fix, and also not wanting to get complacent when you're walking with or for or speaking with. And I think it's such a hard thing to do when you see so much inequity, to also be like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And I think Dorothy Day was really good about guiding us and reminding us we can't solve it all, but we can use what we have to have a community approach and to work together as a people to respond to these inequities. And I think you're seeing that a lot right now among my generation, of what's happening in the West Bank, knowing I'm all the way over here on the East Coast, what can I do? And also if I am in community or in coalitions with people across the world, that is really powerful. And so many times when I was there, Palestinians were saying that at the most loneliest times or despairing times, there was comfort in knowing that there was solidarity from people in different countries. So I think it was a complex trip, and there's a lot there and a lot happening. And also absolutely, when there is the threat of war crimes being committed, I think we are pushed to say something. So yeah.
Thanks. All right, I'm gonna pose our first audience question, which comes from Kevin Cushing. And I think maybe George or Robert could answer this one. It is a question that we get a lot working on the canonization cause, which is, how do you feel about the fact that Dorothy said that she did not want to be called a saint?
I'm happy to say a little something about that, if you don't mind. Yeah. Since I deserve credit or blame, I think, for popularizing that quotation from Dorothy, if she ever actually said that. It was something I heard somewhere or other, and I included in the introduction to my edition of her selected writings many years ago. I think it's given a misleading impression if it makes it sound that Dorothy was cynical about the process of canonization or naming of saints. She had great reverence for saints and the processes of the church, and believed that we were all called to be saints. But she didn't like the implication that people were putting her up on a pedestal, which is the way that we, as she said, often dismiss saints or think of them as exceptional people who have nothing to do with us, and that we could never do these things. So I think that she didn't like that kind of veneration while she was alive. She wanted to challenge people on their own path to holiness. And the question of whether 50 years or so after her death she should be canonized, I think was a matter of utter indifference to her. I don't think she would have anything to say about it. It's not really her problem.
Yeah. George, I wonder if you have anything to add. I mean, surely this is something that you've reckoned with as somebody who has been working on this cause for so long. You're muted. George, could you unmute for us? Thanks.
Colleen, you're right. This question has been there from the beginning, and Robert has been such a strong messenger around the question as you do. I often wonder, what if Dorothy went around saying, "I am a saint"? When are they going to make me a saint? I'm wondering how that would. I wonder how that would have gone over. It's, to me, the tension that exists. And Robert recently has been engaged in a dialogue. The tension that exists is good, I think, for both the institutional church and its process and people at the Catholic Worker. I know that at Dorothy Day's funeral in St. Patrick's, Terence Cardinal Cook said, "I think we may have a saint among us." And I wasn't there, but I heard that there was a gasp, a silence, a breaking out of, wow, this thing could be. And a kind of light went on at that moment. Just one final comment. Cardinal O'Connor invited people who knew Dorothy Day well, Robert being one of them, Eileen Egan, Adi Bethune, people who knew her, and brought them into a room and said, "Okay, what do you think?" And it was almost unanimous that he should proceed with the official church process. So those are the thoughts and ideas that I've been writing on, and that the Dorothy Day Guild has been writing on.
Got it. Now I've got another question for you, George, so stay on. Elaine Ireland asks, "I know the church requires miracles for sainthood," and requires and miracles are in quotes. "The miracle of living in the tension should be enough. Will the Vatican be requiring this sort of validation?"
That's another very, very good question. At our last advisory committee meeting, Louise Zwick, who runs Casa Juan Diego, which is a Catholic worker in Houston. We were talking about this, and she said the miracle is the work that's going on in the over 100 houses in the world where the work of hospitality and friendship and justice is going on. And so that in the process of the canonization of our work, we've tried to document that, to bring that to Rome. Unfortunately, I don't think they're going to regard that as the miracle, but there are so many miraculous moments listening to Fred, you can hear the moments that exist in the world that he just described, and that's miraculous. But I think we're going to have to follow the process for a miracle for blessed. Pope Francis has sometimes waived the second miracle, but again, we need to be open to what might constitute that. But there are canonical requirements that we're going to have to satisfy.
Got it. Thanks. That's a really thoughtful answer. Okay, the last question, and they say this is for any of the panelists. This comes from Claire. I'm so sorry. I should know how to pronounce Polish because my grandmother's Polish, but Rusevich? I'm not sure. She says, this is for any of the panelists. Can you speak to how Dorothy Day is received and understood by young people of faith today? So Melissa, I might tap you for this one since you're my fellow 20-something on this call, but I'll take a crack at it first. I think generally Dorothy Day is somebody who, is already regarded as a saint, I should say, by young folks and by young Catholics today. And I think that I have found that she has an appeal both to very justice-y, very progressive and maybe prophetic Catholic young people who tend to, today as always, flock to the Catholic Worker and like to spend time there, just like I did back when I was in New York, go to the vigils for Yemen, go sit around the table and listen to the stories all night long, go to the Friday meetings. Because we see in Dorothy, and I think I alluded to this before, someone who offers us an example that's very different from a lot of what prevails in the Catholic Church right now. I don't know, maybe my conception of this is skewed because I grew up with Cardinal Burke as my childhood bishop, but the church was very much a conservative force in my childhood. And so to see someone like Dorothy, who chose this radically different path and who was working on all these causes that I found myself attracted to, above all, saying no to war at every point and through the course of the 20th century, which was sort of the century of wars. That was something that really, really spoke to me. And when I speak to other young folks at the Catholic Worker, that's also something that really pulls them in. Melissa, do you have any thoughts to add?
Sure, yeah. I have a unique Catholic experience. I wasn't raised Catholic. I chose to become Catholic when I was 18. It's a story for another time. But in a lot of my work, I do faith-based organizing and get out the vote with first-time voters who also identify with some type of Christian faith. And so often they feel like their faith world has to be over here and their activist world has to be over here. And they know that it is the gospel at heart that inspires them to do the work. But I think when they talk about the things that they're passionate about, whether it's climate change or combating police brutality, they feel that it's often shut down in their church circles. And so I think that what I offer Dorothy Day sometimes as a figure who I think really try to do both. And I think that learning her wisdom is really inspiring for my generation, because I think so often we get pegged as the generations that's leaving the church or doing this. And I would say my generation doesn't care less about justice and doesn't care less about peace or anti-war efforts. But I think that sometimes there's a struggle to find figures to look up to who both hold peace and faith and all of these tricky things. So I definitely think she has a place for young Catholics in terms of living out their faith. And for me, who has chosen to be Catholic, has definitely guided my confirmation that this was part of my life plan. So
yeah. No, obviously we are probably not the only ones on this call who have some insight into this. So would any of the other panelists want to weigh in on how you've seen Dorothy affecting younger folks and younger people of faith today?
Yeah, I think I'll just share. I teach part-time, like adjunct at peace studies at Siena College. And one of the books that I've used that students have really liked is through Orbis Books. Nice plug for Robert Ellsberg there. Dorothy Day, Portraits of Those Who Knew Her by Rosalie Riegel. And it's really an awesome book. I found like the students that I teach, they've really enjoyed this book because it's, it's basically an oral history, people who knew Dorothy telling these stories. And so it reads in a different way. It's much more personal. And I feel like students come away with a sense a little bit about who Dorothy was from her interactions. And a lot of students just find it they find her very relatable, especially as they're wrestling with identity issues around things like what's important, like God, religion, the divine, that whole thing. And then also thinking about right and wrong and justice and what's my responsibility for other people. And in a lot of college students, especially, they've done a lot of community service in high school, especially a lot of Catholic kids as part of their maybe confirmation program, they're doing community service and things like that. And they're really hungry for that advocacy and that justice work. And so Dorothy, because of her linking there of the justice work and these works of mercy, I think a lot of folks really find that to be very attractive, that there's a model there that you can kind of go with. And plus, and to be very frank, Melissa mentioned before about, some younger generations are sometimes pegged as leaving the church in droves. But, the church has largely left young people. It's not the other way around, church leadership has left young people behind, and older church members have left young people behind in a lot of ways. And Dorothy, took church leadership to task. When there was a gravedigger strike in the Archdiocese of New York, she was public in terms of being in solidarity with those gravediggers who wanted a day of rest, believe it or not. I think there's something in the book of Genesis about a day of rest. And that Cardinal Spellman, called them godless communist agitators because they wanted to form a labor union, which we know, was in the 1891 document Rerum Novarum, the papal encyclical from Pope Leo. So Dorothy was, she was grounded in being in solidarity with others. And part of that grounding was from time to time, she stood toe to toe with church leadership. When someone from the Chancery said, we want you to discontinue using the word Catholic in Catholic Worker, Dorothy sent, it's an awesome letter. That letter alone is reason why you should buy Robert Ellsberg's book, The Collection of Letters from Dorothy Day, because the letter Dorothy wrote back to the Chancery, it's a work of art. It's a real masterpiece because she's declining the offer, but she does it in such a way where she's holding her ground, but also being, respectful of them. And I think a lot of young people are looking for ways to like point out what are the ways that church leadership has failed us. We look at the clergy sexual abuse crisis, and we took a very public stand at our Albany Catholic Worker House about that. We advocated for restorative justice processes to be brought in to address this, especially on an administrative level in terms of cover-ups and things like that. But so many people are harmed from this, and it's just a shame. And but here she is, this prophetic voice who not just challenges governments and economic systems, but also challenges church leadership.
Yeah, that's right. I remember the first time that I met Eric Martin, who was involved with the Catholic Worker. He's been he and Dan Kosacci co-edited the Berrigan brothers' letters to one another, and he's been all over this sort of world. The first time I met him was at St. Joe's house, incidentally, on a rainy day just like today, and he was outside having a cigarette. And I started talking to him about these Catholic activists, and particularly the Catonsville Nine, because we were chatting, it was around the 50th anniversary, and I was supposed to be working on an article soon. And he told me he thought that the main thing that Catonsville, but also more broadly, that folks like Dorothy and the Catholic Workers offered is for young folks today who have not so many examples of Catholic leaders who are really engaging in political issues and in just the issues that are closest to their hearts, be that political or even just, their own like life issues. So often we don't have examples of people engaging, Catholic leaders engaging. And Eric said what Dorothy and what the Workers and what the Catonsville Nine offered were examples of Catholics engaging, and that those were sorely needed. So we are just after the hour. I think that is my cue to hand things off to Maureen for the second part of the evening. I want to thank our panelists so very much for a great conversation about Dorothy. It was really a privilege for me to get to hear from all of you, so thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colleen. What an interesting discussion. I almost feel like I'm sitting around a campfire and Dorothy's going to walk in. It's nice to have everyone listening. Appreciate that. I'd like to turn the next phase of our evening over. We're going to be presenting the Madonna della Strada Award. Mary McGinnity, our president and CEO of the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, will tell us more about that. And I think she might have an interesting story or two to share about Dorothy Day. Mary.
Hi, Maureen. Thank you. And thank you to this incredible panel. Colleen, I am so impressed with how you brought out these beautiful stories and dimensions of such a complex woman who has so much to model for us and to teach us. Thank you. Thank you, Robert, George, Joseph, Melissa, and Fred, for your insights and your comments. It really was beautiful to hear that. I'd also like tonight to thank all of you who are participating in this webinar and to all of our sponsors. And I have to give a big shout out to this woman, Maureen Fulham, who is our regional director of IVC in New York. Our IVC directors are my heroes. They're why I get up every day to work hard, because they do incredible work. So thank you, Maureen, for sponsoring tonight and for the work that you do every day to recruit Service Corps members and put them into service. My job tonight is really to introduce the Madonna della Strada Award. But before I do that, I'd like to just take a minute and share with all of you that one of the most personal things around tonight's conversation was it allowed me to go back into a very special moment in my own personal life. At 21 years old, I had joined the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. And I was placed into Newark, New Jersey, into the inner city there to teach and to serve. And I did that work for 2 years. And during those years, I had the opportunity to go into New York City and to go to the Catholic Worker in New York City and to listen to Dorothy Day personally. She would have these Friday night kind of open sessions or hospitality nights, and people could just come and listen. And I remember the first time that I went there, and we knew about this woman, we knew about what she stood for. And I remember the first night that I sat there and listened to her. And the thing that struck me was not her words, but her presence, and watching the people, the homeless people, the people in the streets, the people who were there for hospitality, beam in her presence. They were beautiful to her, and they knew they were beautiful to her. And she was authentic in that conveyance of love and care. And it was concrete and palpable. And I, as a 21-year-old, searching in my own life on what really matters, what are values, what does it mean to be gospel love in this world? What does it mean to follow Christ? And I saw in this human being, in this woman, how she would bring out the beauty in other people. Her love was incredible. And I'm so grateful to tonight's panelists to help me revisit that memory, because it is a very powerful experience that I know a lot of people continue to live out in this world in very, very powerful and quiet ways. So I want to segue that memory to the Madonna della Strada Award. Madonna della Strada Award is an award that IVC conveys to organizations, to people and individuals in our regional communities who live out the gospel values of love, who live out the call of the gospel spiritual ministry to seek social justice, to care about the human being, and to do it in lifelong and profound ways. And tonight, IVC is going to benefit to convey this award to the Dorothy Day Guild. It is named after Madonna della Strada, which is the icon of Mary of the streets, Mary of the way, and conveys, this is where hung in the Church of Gesù in Rome, which is the church where St. Ignatius is the heart of the Society of Jesus. It is where St. Ignatius asked his followers to go out into the streets and to bring the gospel and to mission and to serve. St. Ignatius's comment on, it's been attributed to him, that gospel love is conveyed in deeds of service. So he wanted his companions to be there on the streets with men and women in need to serve. And that is a beautiful bridge to the Dorothy Day Guild. But tonight, receiving this award is a human being, Jeff Corgan, that I have known for many, many years. Jeff himself has been a human being who has lived out in his work and in his personal life the gospel message of love and deeds of service. So, Jeff, we convey this award to the Dorothy Day Guild. We welcome you to be the recipient of this award, and we're very honored to be able to bestow it upon you. Thank you.
Oh, that's really sweet of you, Mary. I just have to say that the real winners in all this are the amazing volunteers we've gotten from the Ignatian Volunteer Corps. We started out with Dr. Joe, and he did an amazing job, created all of these systems of checking. If you can imagine 100 transcribers all over the world, transcribing over 10,000 poorly handwritten pages. I mean, anyone who tells you that, handwriting was really good back in the old days did not meet Dorothy Day. I'm so impressed with the work that our transcribers did and Joe's work in supervising them and making sure that everything was done to the standards that the Congregation for the Causes of Saints demand. And Pat Figueredo, also a volunteer, did a fantastic job. He was one of our ace transcribers. Jody Fink, when COVID hit, Jody Fink figured out a way to print this stuff out outside of our headquarters on 1011 First Avenue. The volunteers couldn't go in because of the COVID restrictions on number of people in the building, but they found ways to work even so. So we're really proud of them there. Jody's work to print things out, Pat's work transcribing. John Dowd also did amazing work transcribing, but he also did a lot of additional work on Dorothy's publications, making sure that they were all copied onto the right size paper. They use A4 size paper in Europe, so guess what? We had to go find some. And John made sure that we never copied on the wrong kind of paper, made sure that it suited the unusual margins that they require. And I think that the volunteers probably saved us 3 years in Dorothy's cause. So if this sails through in the papacy of Pope Francis, we can give credit, I think, to the Ignatian volunteers. And there's one more volunteer that I just have to recognize, which is Bill Woods, who we actually swore him into an office called investigator because he was so good at getting things unstuck. Just a quick anecdote. when our Roman postulator was with us in New York and kind of going over all the evidence. We have 40,000 pages of evidence, and he'd look over everything, and then we were talking to him. Yeah, Dorothy did this, Dorothy did that. Oh yeah, and she was arrested 8 times. He said, what? He had never heard of a candidate for sainthood who had been arrested so many times, or really at all. Of course, then we told him one of them was for prostitution, which was a frame job because she was at a IWW house, International Workers of the World house, and they were constantly harassed there. This was in her younger days before her conversion. And so, Valdery said, hey, you got to get these arrest records so you can explain it all. And we couldn't get a peep out of the law enforcement agencies we contacted. These are really, really old arrests. And Bill said, he's a lawyer. He says, I know some people in law enforcement. And he went out there and he got them, and was really able to win the day. And when we were having trouble finding some articles about Dorothy that we wanted to make sure got sent to the congregation, Bill said, I know some librarians. So whenever we needed something, he figured out how to get it. So from the transcriptions to Dorothy's publications to making sure that we got what we needed, we really had incredible support from the Ignatian Volunteer Corps. So thank you, Mary, and thank you, Maureen, for bringing these wonderful people to us. And we look forward to celebrating this with them as we get towards November. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you for your passion for the church and for your love and passion for social justice. So now we're going to move on to the last segment of our evening. We're going to be presenting something we're calling the Dorothy Day Service Award. It's really the inaugural Service Award. And this kind of came about through our relationship. And I know at IVC, I hear so frequently from Mary, from my boss, Becky, Steve, and we know that from our lives and our relationships with God. It's all about our relationship with God. It's all about relationships. And we kind of started talking, and we thought, let's give a service award in terms of our ingratitude. Dorothy, as George said on her gravestone, is Deo gratias. We want to say ingratitude for our service and relationship with the Guild and with IVC. So that's one of the things this is about. So the award says on it, one of Dorothy's quotes, "You will know your vocation by the joy it brings you. You will know when it's right." And I think that says something about love and service, which captured her life. And I think captures our lives as we're attracted to God and going into service. So let me move on and name our award.
Could I interrupt you, Maureen? Because I forgot somebody. I feel like one of these people that then gets the music comes on and they go off and they try to get back on stage. But Nick Farnham did an amazing job tracking down the Catholic worker houses around the world and delivering with a couple other volunteers, delivering a report on all of the houses in the world. Not all of them responded, but they got about 2/3 of the folks that they reached out to. So kudos to Nick for that. And I'm so sorry I blew it there.
Well, that's fantastic. Well, we have the award here for him. So thank you, Jeff. So we're going to look at, I think Steve is going to share something on the screen for us. And so here's the first award for John Dowd. I think he's here with us tonight. I'm giving a shout out to John. And then to Patrick Figuerito. as Nick Farnham, Patrick Figueredo, Jody Fink. Jeff talked about what Jody had done, especially during COVID. And as Jeff said, Nick Farnham dealt a lot with the communications. He did a lot with the communications of, I think, one of the webinars that was done at the end of November. Patrick did a lot with the transcriptions. John Dowd had a very onerous task, but did it with love. Our next is William Woods, our attorney who went to the ends of the earth to find out information and deal with Dorothy's arrest records. And Joe Sclafani, who really coordinated the transcriptions and really worked with all the volunteers. So I think Joe would like to say a few words on behalf of the group.
Thank you. Yes, I do want to thank you with great gratitude for these awards on behalf of all of my friends at the IVC who worked with me together. I can tell you that, and I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone who works in the field of social justice or working for the poor, that you get far more than you give. And although we enjoyed the work, we received so much more in just finding a new community that we feel comfortable in, that speaks to the ideas of social justice and of care for the poor. And I just want to point one thing out. When we look at the IVC and we look at Dorothy Day, you go back to the mission statement of the IVC, and the Ignatian Volunteer Corps has a mission to provide opportunities of service to the poor and to promote justice and to grow in faith. And I think that I've been so grateful personally that the IVC has really done so much personally for me in all of those areas. And it's also not a surprise that if we were around, the Ignatian Volunteer were around in the 1970s, she would probably really like the members of the Ignatian Volunteer Corps. I mean, we're talking the same language. This could be her mission statement as well, of how she would want to live her life, particularly growing in faith. She found that really wonderful balance of energy, and that's where she derived all of her energy, from her faith, to do the really tough things that she did with service to the poor and promoting justice. I did want to just give a couple of thank yous to before ending. I certainly wanted to thank Maureen, who was the first person I met associated with the Ignatian Volunteer Corps. And she's done so much for me personally, not only with my work with the Dorothy Day Guild, but in terms of my faith and the fellowship that we all share with the Ignatian Volunteer Corps in New York City. So thank you very much for that. And I'm speaking on behalf, I'm sure, of all of our Ignatian Volunteer Corps members when I say that. I also want to give a big shout out to George. George is now, I consider him a friend. He has been a fountain of wisdom and inspiration, I think, for all of us. Whenever any of us from the Ignatian Volunteer Corps came to our office, he always took the time to speak to us, to find out what we were doing, to make sure we were happy with what we were doing. And we always felt welcome there. And I really appreciate that. And he is still a good role model for me. Finally, I want to really give a special thank you to Jeff. Jeff has been, for me, a mentor, an advocate, an educator, and everything in between at the Dorothy Day Guild. We talk about all the wonderful things that we've done here as part of the Ignatian Volunteer Corps, but he masterminded this whole project. I mean, he took care of not only diaries, but all of the intricacies of the requirements that are necessary for us to move forward in our effort to canonize Dorothy Day. So I really want to say a big thank you for him. On behalf of all of us, I think we very much appreciate his caring and his personal touch when it came to all of us. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe, and congratulations. Well, this really concludes our time together. I want to thank everyone. I first would like to congratulate the honorees again, the Dorothy Day Guild, John Dowd, Patrick Figueredo, Jody Fink, Nick Farnham, Bill Woods, and Joe Sclafani. Congratulations, and also to give a special thank you to our panelists that we could engage in this kind of discussion about this special yet ordinary woman. Very special, but Dorothy would want to be called ordinary, I'm sure. So thank you to Colleen Dulle, our wonderful moderator. Thank you to Melissa Cedillo, to Fred Boehrer, to George Horton. Thank you to Robert Ellsberg. Joe is one of our panelists. And I said Fred, but I really want to leave you with, we've been talking about that quote, "The world will be saved by beauty," but I think it's a wonderful way to end because we're in challenging days, but we're seeing the light. So I think we're all being saved by the beauty that is God and community. So thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thanks, everyone. It was great to meet you.